Okay, so let's just discuss a little bit about printing this image. The first thing to do is, when you get towards the end of your painting process, or you can do it any time actually, but it's most efficient to do it at the end, is you make your first hard proof, which means you actually make a print. And that print should be on as good a paper as you can, and it should be, if possible, it should be close to your finished paper. It's tempting to make your proofs on like a cheaper paper or something like that, particularly if you're making big prints, but at some point you do need to do it on the paper that you're going to finally output to, because there's a lot of difference between papers. So let's say you've made your hard proof, and essentially what you do is you go through it and you make a list of things that you need to change. So some of the things I had to look at in this particular image was, when I printed, and this is a common problem, you find that there's areas which are muddy, so there's a lack of contrast in those areas. That's one problem I had with. So I solved that through this levels adjustment layer up here. So I'll just turn that on and off, and you can see. So you can see that's adding quite a bit of contrast and removing that mud. So generally, overall the Thangka was too dark, which is a very common problem, and it was muddy. So if I open up my levels, you can see I've squashed the whites all the way down to here, where white just starts to begin to appear. The first white pixels show up on the histogram, and I've squashed up the blacks by I've come up 7, and I've done a couple of test prints. Initially I had 3 here, and then I arrived at 7, and that seems to be getting the Thangka where you want it. It's nice and what in photography you call punchy or something like that. It's like the image is sharp. You can really muck up at this stage if you make some bad decisions. So the two wrong decisions you can make at this point is to make it too contrasty, too sharp, and above all, too much saturation. So you see, looking at your image and you're not happy with it for some reason, you think, oh, I'll make it more saturated. And it kind of pleases the eye a little bit in the first instance. It's a bit like eating something sugary, adding saturation. But I'd advise you to think about your saturation levels and look at some of the old Thangkas and try and find the beauty and the subtlety of the colour, rather than just trying to solve problems in the Thangka with this like sledgehammer approach of making things more saturated. And then people look at your Thangka and think, oh, look at the colours are beautiful, but there's subtlety that could be brought out if you could work a little bit harder without just hitting the saturation button and bringing it up to saturation. And then of course the second thing is making it too contrasty. Both of those things will improve your image in a unsophisticated way. Better to improve your image the way an artist who is using paints would, rather than just a quick and dirty method. So that's my advice. You don't need to sharpen anything. Like, it's very common if you use Photoshop and you've been using any of the photography tools or working with your own photos. Everyone loves to sharpen things. There's no need to sharpen anything on a Thangka. In 95% of all instances, they're plenty sharp. They probably need blur, if anything. That crispness, that harsh sharpness that you can introduce by using the sharpen filters, I don't think it serves the image well, and it's not something that was ever achievable with paint. So beware of that. Okay, so let's say you've made your list and you've made all the corrections. You want to do your final print. I'll bring up the print dialog box and we'll just take a brief look at the settings that I recommend for a Thangka, and I'll tell you why I recommend those settings. So first thing to say is, actually before we do that, we'll just, I go on about this every tutorial, but always have your black and white image ready. So just before you're finalising, when you're signing off on your image, doing your final prints, just make sure you're still checking it in black and white to make sure that the image is working. It gives you a new set of eyes. So straight away, I'm really happy with this image in black and white. So I feel like I don't have any more work to do with the levels or the adjusting areas of tonality or shading. So that's just another tip. Always keep using your black and white preview all the way to the end. Okay, so Command P will bring up the print dialog box. Here we are on the Mac. So on the Mac it's different to the PC. I actually prefer the PC dialog box for printing in Photoshop. If you're using, I've tried some of the cheaper printing programs, painting programs. There's an excellent one that's come out, Affinity I think it's called. It's absolutely brilliant. But at the moment, or at the time I looked at it, has absolutely no ability to print. So for me that essentially renders it useless. The colour management system within Photoshop has been worked on since the beginning of printing from the desktop, and Adobe have really got it right. It's the place to print from. If you have another program, I've not seen any of the cheaper programs that have any sophisticated colour management system, which means when you go to print your Thangka, it's going to look nothing like it does on the screen, and you're going to be lost in terms of how to resolve those problems. So if you can get Photoshop, I recommend it for that, if nothing else. If you don't print, then it doesn't matter. So here we are, Photoshop print settings. So first thing to say is you need to go to your printer, which is your Epson. I only have an Epson, so I can't tell you about Canon or anything like that. There'll be heaps of stuff about this on YouTube. I have these settings, match print colours, gamut warning you can have. If you're a bit prone to oversaturating things, you can have your gamut warning. And all that does is it just introduces that grade preview in colours that are unprintable. That's what gamut means. Out of gamut means they're unprintable. So if you've really saturated it, the dialog box is going to say, I can't print any of the colours that you've chosen. I'm going to choose for you the nearest colour, and that's when things get really gross. Because then out of your hands it's like just a computer program saying, oh, I can't print that colour, I'm going to print this instead. So that's gamut warning. So it's just, I don't have it on all the time, it's just good to check. Here you can see the out of gamut colours are, for me, are particularly dark saturated areas, but there's not a lot of it, so I'm not worried about that. Match print colours, that is important to have on, because it attempts to reproduce for you the contrast that is the loss of contrast that you'll have going from screen to paper. And then paper white attempts to give you a preview of the white of your paper. So there's things called optical brightness, which means you can get your paper is essentially whiter than white. So you can get very sharp, harsh whites. And there's generally never any white in Thangkas. So it's not as important to us to have optically brightened papers. In addition to that, none of the optically brightened papers are archival. So best to avoid that in terms of making sure your dailies that you print live for a long time. Okay, so print settings, I'll ignore that for a little bit. Most important thing, everyone will tell you this, is colour management. Photoshop manages colour. If you have, there's two problems you can have. You can have printer manages colour, or you can have both the printer and Photoshop managing colour if you do something weird. And then you'll get nothing like what you want. So Photoshop has to manage the colour, not the printer. Printer profile. So this is a profile that is created to reproduce a certain paper on a certain printer. So here's the printer, Epson Stylus 4900, which is me, and the paper I'm using is 49, sorry, that's the printer, cold press natural, MK means matte black. The natural here means without optical brighteners. There's a bright cold press paper that Epson makes, and that has optical brighteners and is not archival. So I choose the natural. Cold press is my favourite paper. It's inexpensive. It has fantastic what's called D-Max. It has an incredibly dark and deep black, and the texture is just right for what I want. It's not overly textured like a heavy watercolour paper, but it's not smooth either. I don't like smooth papers either. It's really, and you can also print on both sides of it, which makes it fantastic for doing proofs. It's a good weight. I think it's 300 weight. It's just an exceptional paper, in my opinion. I've tried a lot of papers, and this is the one I always come back to. It's very sharp. It's very, very good paper. Okay, so that's our paper. What are we doing? Normal printing, rendering intent. This is important. So there's two options here. They give you 4, but you're only ever going to use 2. Perceptual or relative colorimetric. So they're the 2 that most people will use. I would avoid using relative colorimetric for printing Thangkas. What happens with this rendering intent is it mainly affects the way the dark colours are rendered in your image. So what it'll say is let's say when you look at your picture on the screen, there's a lot of detail in the dark areas of your Thangka. So down here, in this dark area that I have, let's say I can see a lot of detail. There may not be enough colours in your printer to resolve that on a piece of paper. It looks fine on the screen, but on a piece of paper, it can't be resolved. So what these 2 rendering intents do is they squash those colours down into something that can be printed. And what that means for the viewer is that the areas that had this incredible detail in your dark areas, what's called shadow detail, will be squashed together, and all that detail will be lost. Not all of it, but it'll become muddy. What was crisp and clear will become muddied. And that beautiful area will no longer work in the Thangka. It'll be unattractive to the eye. So relative colorimetric, even though it's one of the choices you can choose, if you one of the good choices, I'd avoid saturation and absolute colorimetric. Relative colorimetric, if you have a dark Thangka, will completely trash your dark areas. It'll make the print look too dark, and that's the biggest complaint people have. You print your colour image and you say, oh man, it's too dark, I can't see anything in those shadow areas. Relative colorimetric is one of the causes of that. The second biggest cause of that is having an uncalibrated monitor which is turned up too bright, or even a calibrated monitor that's turned up too bright. And you get your new monitor and you turn everything up to 11 and you work at that level, but the printer doesn't understand those levels at all. It's expecting something that's much, much darker. So you need to have the brightness on your monitor turned down, if not calibrated correctly. Then you have a chance of printing something close to what you're seeing on your screen. By the way, you can't actually print on paper what you can see on the screen. They're just not the same colour spaces, and they're not the same. The gamuts are different, which means the colours that are possible to be displayed are different. So don't try to chase something that can't be achieved. At this point in time, you can't get something to print exactly the same as it looks on your screen. The colours that are possible to be reproduced on the screen can't be printed with inks at this point in time. There's only a narrow band of colours which are printable, and that's what's called gamut. Okay, I always choose perceptual. Okay, so next we just go across to print settings. So again, this is a little different between Mac and PC. none of these layout things are they are important, but you can work that out for yourselves because we're different for everyone and different for every printer. What I will show you though is the printer settings. Most of this will be taken care of, but you just need to make sure your media type is the correct one. Cold press natural here, so that means that the printer knows the thickness of the paper and the handling properties of the paper, so that the printhead doesn't crash into it. This hasn't got to do with colour, this has got to do with the physical properties of the paper. So that needs to be correct. You need to have matte black selected. If you choose photographic black, generally your printer won't let you do that, mine won't. But some software systems may and some printers may. Make sure you print in matte black if you're printing on matte paper. I recommend if you can't decide for yourself, the best possible way to display your digital images is on a high Dmax archival matte watercolour paper behind glass, and they will look absolutely stunning. Canvas is nice if you want it to look like a Thangka, if you want to brocade it, but the colour reproduction of canvas is nowhere near the quality that it is of paper. You get even better reproduction on gloss paper, but it just looks like a photograph, and it doesn't. To me, that's never ever been an option to print on gloss. If you print if you print on gloss and then choose to frame it in glass, then you get two levels of gloss. There's gloss from the glass and there's gloss from the surface of the paper, and that creates all sorts of problems as well. So I recommend good heavy matte paper behind glass. 16-bit output. I don't understand that, and frankly I don't think it matters. You can research that if you want. That's only been a new thing. I believe your image has to be 16-bit to take use of that, but if you painted one of these Thangkas in 16-bit, the file size would be out of control. Output resolution, so just at the highest resolution that your printer provides. Here you've got a couple of options in the Epson. You've got high speed. High speed just means that the printhead prints on both passes, in both directions, so it prints going from left to right and right to left. If you can notice a difference in quality between high speed and normal, then choose the normal speed, but if you can't, then why not print at high speed? Mirror image, I've never used that. Finest detail is an option that Epson have. I can't notice a difference. You may notice a difference on gloss paper because it resolves more detail, but on matte paper, I can't see a difference. Okay, that's it. Advanced colour settings, that's only relevant if you've got the printer managing the colour. We've got Photoshop managing the colour, so it's not an option. That's it, and then save, and then you can choose to print. So I hope that gives you a little bit of information on the options for printing. It's a complex and difficult thing. I'm happy for you to ask me questions. Like as I said, I only have experience with Photoshop and Epson printers, so I'm in no stretch of the meaning of the word an expert or even know anything about it. But I just know what works for me. If you're doing Thangkas, the main thing is to go to perceptual, particularly if they're dark, and to make sure you're using a good paper with the correct what's called a colour profile. If you don't have the colour profile loaded here, then your printer's expecting something else. It's like the printer doesn't know what you feed it. You have to tell it what you're feeding it, and it's going to only output correctly if you tell it that it's eating the right thing. Okay, so that's that. There's a thing called soft proof, which we can do quickly. Soft proof just means trying to get it look as good on your screen, soft meaning software, as good on your screen before you go to print it. You can do a thing called a soft proof, as I said, and that's trying to get what's on your screen look like a piece of paper. So here in View, Proof Setup, and then click on Custom. And here in the custom proof condition dialog box, there's nothing much you need to worry about here. You just need to tell it what kind of paper you're expecting to feed the printer. So here, Epson cold pressed natural. So this is all the kinds of colour profiles that I've installed on this computer, and some of them came with the computer. So you can see there's all different kinds of paper here that I've experimented with, or many of them I haven't used at all. But from this list you need to choose the paper that you're going to feed the printer. And that paper is Epson Cold Press Natural. MK means matte black, K is for black, version 2. Okay, rendering intent is perceptual. Again, I could choose relative colorimetric here. I'm choosing perceptual, and what this dialog box is telling you or offering you is the ability to attempt to replicate on the screen what you'll see on paper. Okay, so that's got that set up. I'll hit OK. And now, by toggling between Command Y or Control Y, we can turn that preview on and off. And you'll see up here in the this little top part here, which tells you what the information about your image. You'll see it change. When I go Command Y, that means it's got Epson Cold Press Natural, colour space added to it. So if I zoom in a little bit for you, press Tab, here's our image, and let's toggle. So here this is with the preview on, that's preview off. Preview on, preview off. And that's, again, as I said, attempting to show you what you'll see on paper. So what you're seeing is the reduction in contrast and a reduction in what you see in the shadow areas there. So you notice the shadow areas become a little bit more muddy, and that's what you'll expect to see on paper. So that's soft proofing. Based on what you see on the soft proof, you can make changes to your image so that you get what's on the screen, so that when you press Command Y and you have a look at the preview, you're happy with it. So that may involve squashing up the shadows using the levels command, or brightening it a little bit. It'll just depend on your image. Okay, that's soft proofing.